I thought I knew everything about my perfect family until that DNA test arrived in my mailbox and revealed we were related to one of America. These most notorious serial killers. My name is Jessica, and I'm 34 years old. Growing up, I was always told I was the luckiest kid in the world. My family was what you'd call picture perfect, the kind you see in those cheesy holiday commercials, where everyone's laughing around a dinner table, passing dishes, and sharing inside jokes. My dad, Robert, was a high school principal who coached Little League on weekends. My mom, Linda, taught third grade and volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. We lived in a beautiful colonial house in suburban Connecticut with a white picket fence. Literally, I'm not making that up. My parents actually painted it white every spring like some kind of Norman Rockwell painting come to life. I had an older brother, Michael, who was studying to be a doctor, and a younger sister, Emma, who was already showing signs of becoming the family artist. Our Sunday dinners were legendary in our neighborhood. Mom would make her famous pot roast, and we'd all gather around that massive oak dining table that had been in our family for generations, telling stories and planning our next family vacation. The thing about my family that everyone always commented on was how close we were. Not in a weird, codependent way, but genuinely connected. We actually enjoyed each other's company. When other kids complained about family game night or holiday gatherings, I never understood it. Those were my favorite times. My parents had this incredible love story that they'd tell us every anniversary. They met in college at a coffee shop where Mom was studying for her education finals and Dad was cramming for his psychology degree. He spilled coffee on her textbook, and instead of being angry, she laughed and said it improved the chapter on child development. They were inseparable from that moment on. What made their story even more romantic was that they were both adopted. They joked that they found each other because they were both looking for the family they never had, and boy did they create one. Our house was always full of laughter, music, and the smell of whatever amazing thing Mom was cooking. Dad used to tell us bedtime stories about our family tree, creating elaborate tales about brave ancestors who sailed across oceans and built cities. Since neither he nor Mom knew their biological families, these stories were pure imagination. But they made us feel connected to something bigger than ourselves. He'd spin yarns about great-great-grandparents who were inventors, explorers, and artists. The Thompson legacy, he'd say, with a theatrical voice, is one of courage, kindness, and creativity. We'd drift off to sleep feeling proud of whatever blood ran through our veins. Even if we didn't know exactly where it came from, growing up adopted never felt like a big deal in our house. It wasn't a secret or a source of shame, it just was. Mom and Dad were open about it from the beginning. They'd explain that our biological parents loved us so much they wanted us to have the best life possible, and that led us to them. It was a beautiful narrative that made us feel chosen rather than abandoned. The only time the adoption thing ever came up in any meaningful way was during school projects about family trees or when we get those genetic trait worksheets in biology class. While other kids could trace their eye color and height back through generations, we just shrugged and make educated guesses based on what we could observe about ourselves. Michael inherited Dad's analytical mind and Mom's patience, which made perfect sense for his medical career path. Emma got what we assumed were artistic genes from somewhere, spending hours drawing and painting with a talent that seemed to come from nowhere. And me? I was supposedly the perfect blend of both parents. Organized like Dad, nurturing like Mom, with a strong sense of justice that made me want to become a social worker. Our extended family was made up of friends who became like aunts and uncles, neighbors who'd known us since we were babies, and Mom's teaching colleagues who'd watched us grow up. Every major holiday, our house would be packed with this chosen family, and it felt more authentic and loving than what I saw in many biological families. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was about 15. Mrs. Henderson from next door made some comment about how nice it was that my parents had saved 3 kids from the system. Mom overheard and gently but firmly corrected her. "We didn't save anyone," she said with that teacher voice that could quiet a room. "These 3 saved us. We're the lucky ones." That was so typical of my parents. They never let anyone make us feel like charity cases or second-choice children. To them, and therefore to us, our family was exactly as it was meant to be. The older I got, the more I appreciated how intentional my parents had been about creating our family culture. Every tradition, every rule, every value was carefully chosen and consistently reinforced. We said please and thank you. We helped with chores without being asked. We respected each other's belongings and feelings, and we always had each other's backs. When I went away to college, I was shocked to discover how dysfunctional some of my friends' families were. Siblings who hadn't spoken in years, parents who played favorites, holiday gatherings that ended in screaming matches. It made me realize how extraordinary my childhood had been. I'd call home every week, and my parents would fill me in on all the family news. Dad's latest coaching victory, Mom's newest rescue dog at the shelter, Michael's progress in medical school, Emma's latest art project. Even hundreds of miles away, I felt wrapped in that warm family cocoon. After college, I moved back to Connecticut, got my master's in social work, and found a job at a family services agency about an hour from home. It felt perfect, close enough to have Sunday dinners with my family, but far enough away to establish my independence. I bought a little house, adopted a dog following Mom's example, and started building my own life while staying connected to the foundation my parents had given me. By the time I was 30, I was working as a supervisor at the agency, had a serious boyfriend named David, who fit seamlessly into our family dynamic. I was starting to think about having kids of my own. Life felt stable, predictable, and blessed. The funny thing is, I never felt particularly curious about my biological family. Maybe it's because my adopted family was so fulfilling, or maybe it's because my parents had done such a good job of making us feel complete as we were. Occasionally I'd wonder about medical history stuff. What diseases might I be predisposed to? Where did Emma's artistic talent come from? Things like that. But it never felt urgent. Michael was the same way, even going through medical school, where family history is such a big part of patient care. He never expressed much interest in finding his biological parents. "I know who my parents are," he'd say when classmates asked. "They raised me, loved me, and made me who I am. That's enough." Emma was a little more curious, especially about whether her artistic abilities were inherited. But she was also the youngest and had grown up with the most security about her place in our family. Her curiosity was more academic than emotional. Looking back, I think part of why we were desperate to know our origins was because our parents had never made us feel like we were missing anything. They'd given us identity, values, traditions, and most importantly, unconditional love. What more could we possibly need? This contentment with not knowing would make what happened next even more shocking. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss, and sometimes the truth you do and know. You looking for is the one that will shatter everything you thought you understood about yourself and the people you love most. Everything started to change during what should have been one of the happiest times in my life. David and I had gotten engaged the previous Christmas, and we were deep in wedding planning mode. It was March, and we'd set the date for October. A fall wedding in Connecticut, just like I'd always dreamed of. One evening, while we were addressing invitations at my kitchen table, David brought up something I'd never really considered before. "Have you ever thought about doing one of those DNA tests?" he asked casually, not looking up from the envelope he was addressing to his cousin in California. "What kind of DNA test?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea what he meant. Those ancestry kits had been all over social media lately, with people posting excited updates about discovering they were 12% Irish or finding long-lost relatives. You know, like Ancestridna or 23andDom. My sister did one last year and found out we have family in Scotland we never knew about. She's been messaging with some distant cousins over there. He finally looked up at me, his expression thoughtful. "I just thought it might be interesting to know more about your background, especially now that we're thinking about having kids." The kids part hit me. We'd been talking about starting a family right after the wedding, and I'd been feeling increasingly anxious about the medical history blank spaces on all those forms you fill out at the doctor's office. What if I passed on some genetic disease I didn't know I was carrying? What if there were hereditary conditions David should know about? "I've thought about it," I admitted, "mainly for the health stuff. It would be nice to know if there's anything I should be worried about passing on to our children." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. Every time I saw an advertisement for DNA testing, every time someone posted ancestry results on Facebook, every time a patient at work mentioned finding biological family through genetics, that seed grew a little bigger. The tipping point came in April. I was having lunch with my friend Rachel, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She was telling me about a case they'd had recently. A young mother who'd discovered through routine genetic testing that she carried a gene mutation that put her at extremely high risk for ovarian cancer. The scary part, Rachel said, taking a bite of her salad, is that she had no idea. Her adopted family had no medical history to share, and she might never have known if she hadn't gotten pregnant and done the expanded genetic screening. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She had preventative surgery, hysterectomy, and oophorectomy at 28. It probably saved her life, but she can't have any more kids. Rachel shook her head. Made me realize how lucky I am to know my family's medical history going back 3 generations. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel's story. What if I was carrying some genetic time bomb I didn't know about? What if I passed something devastating to my children that could have been prevented if I'd just known? When I brought it up to David again, he was immediately supportive. "If it gives you peace of mind, let's do it," he said. "Both of us. That way we'll have the full picture." I decided to talk to my family about it first. The next Sunday, over Mom's famous pot roast, I brought up the idea casually. "I've been thinking about doing one of those DNA tests," I said, "cutting my meat carefully to avoid looking at anyone directly, for medical information. David and I are planning to have kids, and I thought it might be good to know if there's anything I should be aware of." The reaction was not what I expected. Instead of the supportive enthusiasm I was used to from my family, there was a moment of silence that felt heavier than it should have. "Those tests aren't always accurate," Dad said finally, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. "And they can bring up more questions than answers." Mom nodded in agreement, though she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "I just worry about opening doors that might be better left closed, honey. You have a wonderful family right here. Sometimes the past should stay in the past." Michael looked uncomfortable. "From a medical standpoint, I can see the value," he said slowly. "But Mom and Dad have a point. Those databases can connect you with people who might not want to be found, or who might not be the kind of people you'd want in your life." Emma, always the most direct of us siblings, put down her fork and looked at me. "Are we not enough for you anymore? Why do you need to go digging around in the past?" I was taken aback by the defensive tone in the room. This wasn't like my family at all. We'd always been open about everything, supportive of each other's decisions, curious about the world around us. This felt different, almost protective in a way that made me uncomfortable. "It's not about you guys not being enough," I said, feeling like I was defending something I shouldn't have to defend. "It's about medical information for my future kids. I just want to be responsible. There are plenty of genetic counselors and medical tests that can give you that information without digging into family history," Dad said, and there was something final in his tone that usually meant the conversation was over. But this time, instead of dropping it like I normally would, I found myself pushing back. Why are you all so against this? It's just a DNA test. People do them all the time. The look that passed between my parents was so quick I almost missed it, but it was there. Some kind of communication that excluded the rest of us, and that had never happened in our family before. We're not against it, Mom said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. We just want you to be prepared for whatever you might find. Sometimes biological families gave children up for adoption for complicated reasons. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something my parents weren't telling me. Their reaction had been so out of character, so protective and evasive. Every time I brought up the DNA test again, they'd change the subject or find reasons to cut the conversation short. David started noticing it too. Your parents seem really uncomfortable with this idea, he said after a particularly awkward Sunday dinner where I'd mentioned genetic testing again. Is there something they're not telling you? I didn't have an answer for him, but the question wouldn't leave me alone. My parents, who had always been completely open and honest about everything, were clearly hiding something. And the more they tried to discourage me from doing the test, the more I felt like I needed to know what they were so afraid I might discover. The final straw came in early May. I was at Mom's house helping her plant her spring garden when she brought up the DNA test again. I've been thinking more about what you said, she began, not looking up from the marigolds she was planting. It's about the genetic testing. I really think you should reconsider. Mom, why are you so worried about this? I asked, sitting back on my heels and really looking at her. She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. Some families have secrets, Jessica. Dark things that are better left buried. I just don't want you to get hurt by something that has nothing to do with who you really are. What kind of secrets? I pressed. I don't know, she said, but there was something in her tone that made me think she was lying. That's the point. Opening those doors can let in things you're not prepared for. That night, I made a decision. I ordered the DNA kit online and scheduled it to be delivered to my office instead of my house. I wasn't trying to be sneaky exactly, but I also didn't want to deal with my family's strange resistance anymore. When the kit arrived 3 days later, I stared at the box for a long time before opening it. Inside was a simple saliva collection tube and instructions that seemed straightforward enough. The whole process would take about 6 to 8 weeks from when I mailed it back. I followed the instructions, sealed the sample, and dropped it in a mailbox on my way to work. As I watched it disappear into that blue postal box, I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety that I couldn't quite explain. I decided not to tell anyone I had actually done it. Not David, not my siblings, certainly not my parents. I'd wait for the results, see what medical information I could gather, and then decide how much to share with everyone else. But as the weeks passed and I waited for those results, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just set something in motion that I couldn't control. My family's reaction had planted seeds of doubt and curiosity that were growing stronger every day. What were they so afraid I might find? What kind of secrets could be so dark that my loving, open parents would rather I remain ignorant? I started paying closer attention to my parents' behavior, looking for clues I might have missed before. They seemed more tense than usual. I caught them having whispered conversations that stopped abruptly. When I entered the room, the waiting became almost unbearable. Every day I'd check my email obsessively, looking for that notification that my results were ready. And every day I became more convinced that whatever those results revealed was going to change everything. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June. I was sitting at my desk at the Family Services Agency, halfway through my second cup of coffee and reviewing case files, when my phone buzzed with the notification I'd been both anticipating and dreading for weeks.
And Saturday.
My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment I just stared at the screen, my cursor hovering over the link. This was it. After months of wondering, weeks of family tension, and days of obsessive email checking, I was about to learn something about my biological background. I looked around the office to make sure no one was watching, then clicked the link. The website prompted me to log in, and then I was staring at a loading screen that seemed to take forever. When the results finally appeared, I was immediately overwhelmed by the amount of information. There were pie charts showing my ethnic breakdown, lists of DNA matches with varying degrees of relationship, and health predisposition reports. I decided to start with what I'd originally been most interested in, the medical information. The health section was actually reassuring. No major genetic red flags, no carrier status for serious inherited diseases. Nothing that would prevent me from having healthy children. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This part, at least, was exactly what I'd hoped to find. Then I moved to the ancestry results. According to the test, I was predominantly Northern European, about 40% English and Irish, 20% German, 15% Scandinavian, with smaller percentages of various other European countries. Nothing too surprising there, though it was cool to see it laid out in colorful charts. But it was the DNA matches section that would change everything. The first thing I noticed was that I had a lot of matches, hundreds of them ranging from close family to distant cousins. Most showed up as fourth cousins or more distant, which made sense given how these tests work. Where there right at the top of the list was something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Close family, DNA match, 1,847 cm centimorgans. The profile name was Robert_M_1962. And according to the site's relationship predictor, this person was most likely my half-sibling uncle or grandparent. Given that the profile indicated the person was born in 1962, they were probably around my parents' age, which made half-siblings seem unlikely. I clicked on the profile, but there wasn't much information. No family tree, no additional details, just that username and birth year. However, there was a messaging feature that would let me contact them directly. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. This was exactly the kind of thing my parents had been worried about, finding biological family members who might want contact, who might have information about why I'd been given up for adoption, who might complicate the beautiful life I'd built with my adopted family. But I was also intensely curious. If this person was my uncle or grandparent, they might have medical information that could be useful. They might have answers to questions I didn't even know I had. I decided to look at more of my matches before making any decisions about contact. As I scrolled through the list, I started noticing patterns. Many of my matches had family trees attached to their profiles, and several of them seemed to connect to a common surname, Caldwell. I started clicking through family trees trying to trace connections. It was like putting together a complex puzzle where I could only see some of the pieces. But slowly a picture started emerging. Many of my matches traced back to a family called Caldwell that had lived in upstate New York in the mid-1900s. And then I found something that made my stomach drop. One of my fourth cousin matches had an extensive family tree that included newspaper clippings and historical documents. As I browsed through it trying to trace our connection, I came across a section titled Family Tragedies and Dark History. Wow. The first clipping was from 1987, the headline that made me feel sick. Local man arrested in connection with string of murders. The article was about a man named William Caldwell, age 42, who had been arrested for the murders of at least 6 women in the Albany area between 1983 and 1987. The details were horrific. He'd targeted young women who resembled his ex-wife, strangling them and leaving their bodies in remote locations. But it got worse. As I kept reading, I found more clippings. William Caldwell wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial killer who had terrorized upstate New York for years. The media had dubbed him the Albany Strangler, and his case had been one of the most notorious criminal cases in the region's history. I sat back in my chair, feeling dizzy. This couldn't be right. This had to be some kind of coincidence. There's no way I could be related to a serial killer. My family was good people, teachers and coaches and healers. We volunteered at animal shelters and coached Little League. We were not the kind of people who produced monsters. But as I kept digging through the family tree, the connections became undeniable. William Caldwell's father was named Robert Caldwell Sr., born in 1935, and Robert Caldwell Sr. had several children, including a son named Robert Jr., born in 1962. Robert_M_1962. My closest DNA match. The room started spinning. I got up from my desk and walked to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face and trying to process what I'd just discovered.
Yes.
My biological family wasn't just unknown. They were infamous. I wasn't just adopted. I was apparently the biological child of someone connected to one of the most notorious serial killers in New York State history. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions of work, while my mind raced with questions. How was this possible? How had my parents not known? Did they know and never told me? Was this why they'd been so adamant about me not taking the DNA test? That evening, I called in sick for the next day and drove to my parents' house. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen when I arrived, cleaning up after dinner. They looked up with concern when they saw my face. "Jessica, honey, what's wrong?" Mom asked, immediately moving toward me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sounding strange even to me. "About my adoption, about what you know that you haven't told me." The look that passed between them confirmed what I'd suspected. They knew something. They'd always known something. "Sit down," Dad said quietly. "I'll make some tea." "I don't want tea," I said, probably more sharply than I intended. "I want the truth. I did the DNA test." Mom's face went white. "Oh, Jessica, you knew," I said, and it wasn't a question. "You knew there was something bad in my biological family's history, and you never told me." Dad sat down heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly looking much older than his 65 years. "We hoped you'd never need to know." "Never need to know what?" I demanded. "That I'm apparently related to a serial killer, and my closest biological relative, according to this test, is probably the son of the Albany Strangler?" The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Mom started crying quietly, and Dad put his head in his hands. "How much do you know?" he asked finally. "I know about William Caldwell. I know about what he did. I know that according to my DNA results, I'm closely related to his family." I sat down across from them, my legs suddenly unsteady. "What I don't know is how you knew, why you never told me, and what exactly my connection to all of this is." Mom looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "We never wanted you to carry that burden," she whispered. "We wanted you to be free of it." "Free of what?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I didn't want to hear the answer. Dad took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "William Caldwell was your biological father, Jessica. You're not just related to the Albany Strangler, you're his daughter." The world stopped. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about my very identity, crumbled in that moment. I wasn't just connected to a monster. I was his child. His blood ran through my veins. His DNA was part of mine. I don't remember much about the rest of that evening. I think I screamed. I think I cried. I think my parents tried to comfort me while dealing with their own emotional fallout from finally telling the truths they'd kept hidden for 34 years. All I really remember clearly is the drive home, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process the fact that my entire life had just been turned upside down by a simple DNA test that was supposed to give me peace of mind about having children. Instead, it had revealed that I was the daughter of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. And my parents, the people I trusted most in the world, had known this truth my entire life and chosen to keep it from me. Everything was different now. Everything. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw newspaper headlines, crime scene photos, and the faces of William Caldwell's victims. I kept getting up to look in the mirror, searching for any resemblance to the grainy mugshots I'd found online during my frantic research after leaving my parents' house. Did I have his eyes? His nose? Was there something in my facial structure that should have been a warning sign? I'd spent 34 years looking in mirrors and seeing Jessica Thompson, beloved daughter and soon-to-be wife. Now I was looking at Jessica Caldwell, daughter of a serial killer. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to know everything. Not the sanitized version my parents had been protecting me from, but the real, complete truth about who I was and where I came from. I called in sick to work again and drove to the public library. I wanted to do this research somewhere neutral, away from my home and my office, somewhere I could fall apart if I needed to, without anyone I knew witnessing it. The librarian helped me access newspaper archives and criminal databases. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. William James Caldwell had been born in 1945 to Robert and Mary Caldwell in a small town outside Albany. By all accounts, he'd had a troubled childhood. His father was abusive, his mother was mentally ill, and he'd shown signs of antisocial behavior from an early age. He'd tortured animals, set fires, and had violent outbursts at school. In 1965, at age 20, he'd married a 19-year-old girl named Patricia Stevens. They'd had what appeared to be a normal life for a few years. William worked construction. Patricia was a secretary, and in 1969, they'd had a daughter. According to the records, Patricia had left William in 1970, taking their 1-year-old daughter with her. The divorce papers cited extreme cruelty and fear for the safety of herself and her child. Patricia had moved to Connecticut with her baby and essentially disappeared. It wasn't until 13 years later that William Caldwell began his killing spree. The first victim was found in March 1983, and over the next 4 years, he would murder at least 6 women, though investigators suspected there were more victims who were never found. All of his confirmed victims were young brunettes who bore a striking resemblance to his ex-wife. To my biological mother? To me. The psychological profiles painted a picture of a man consumed with rage over his wife's abandonment, acting out his fantasies of revenge on women who looked like her. Like the daughter he'd lost. Like me. He was finally caught in 1987, when a 7th intended victim managed to escape and identify him. During his trial, which was extensively covered by local media, he showed no remorse for his crimes. In fact, he seemed to take pride in the fear he'd caused. They got what they deserved, he'd said during his sentencing hearing. Just like Patricia will someday. Just like that little brat she stole from me. Reading those words, knowing he was talking about my mother and me, made me physically ill. I had to run to the library bathroom to throw up. When I returned to the computer, I forced myself to keep reading. I needed to understand the full scope of what my parents had been protecting me from. William Caldwell had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was currently housed at Attica Correctional Facility, where he'd been for the past 37 years. According to the most recent records I could find, he was still alive, still in prison, and still refusing to show any remorse for his crimes. But the story didn't end with his incarceration. I discovered that he'd been writing letters for decades to journalists, to true crime enthusiasts, and apparently to anyone who would listen to his twisted justifications for what he'd done. Some of these letters had been published in true crime magazines and websites. In several of them, he mentioned his lost daughter, and expressed a desire to set the record straight about his motivations. Reading his words was like being touched by something evil. His letters revealed a mind that was not just criminal, but genuinely disturbing in its complete lack of empathy or humanity. People don't understand that I was the victim. He'd written in one letter from 1995, "Patricia took my child and destroyed my life. Everything I did after that was her fault. Someday my daughter will understand that her daddy was fighting for justice." I had to stop reading. The idea that this monster considered himself a victim, that he thought I would someday understand or forgive him, was more than I could handle. I spent the next several hours researching Patricia Stevens, my biological mother. What I found was both heartbreaking and illuminating. After leaving William in 1970, Patricia had changed her name and moved to Hartford, Connecticut, where she'd worked as a waitress while trying to care for a toddler alone. According to the records, she'd lived in fear that William would find them. She'd moved several times, always using different last names, always paying rent in cash, always looking over her shoulder. In 1972, when I was 3 years old, Patricia had been diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer. Facing the possibility of death and terrified that William might somehow gain custody of me if something happened to her, she'd made the heartbreaking decision to place me for adoption. The records showed that she'd specifically requested a closed adoption with no possibility of contact. She'd wanted me to have a fresh start, a new identity, and most importantly, safety from the man she knew was dangerous even before he became a killer. Patricia had died in 1973, just 6 months after placing me for adoption. She was 27 years old. She'd spent her last years in fear, alone, and heartbroken over having to give up her child. But she died knowing I was safe with a loving family. Reading about her sacrifice broke something inside me. This woman I'd never known had given up everything to protect me from a monster. And she died young and alone because of it. She'd been a victim long before William Caldwell started killing other women who looked like her. As the day wore on, I started to understand why my parents had kept this secret. They hadn't just been protecting me from the knowledge that my biological father was a serial killer. They'd been protecting me from the full, horrific truth of what that meant. I was the daughter of a man who had murdered women because they reminded him of the wife and child who had escaped him. I was the child whose existence had, in some twisted way, motivated a killing spree that had terrorized an entire region. The women who died looked like me, were killed because they looked like me. The guilt was overwhelming. Intellectually, I knew that none of this was my fault. I'd been a baby when my mother left, a toddler when she died, a child growing up safely in Connecticut when my biological father was committing his crimes. But emotionally, I felt responsible for every one of those women's deaths. If Patricia hadn't had me, she might never have married William Caldwell. If she hadn't left him because of me, he might not have become consumed with the rage that drove him to kill. If those women hadn't looked like me, they might still be alive. I knew this logic was flawed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my very existence had somehow contributed to immense suffering and tragedy. By the time the library closed, I had compiled a complete picture of my biological family's history. William Caldwell was still alive in prison. My mother was long dead. I had an uncle, Robert Caldwell Jr., the Robert_M_1962, from my DNA match, who had apparently been trying to distance himself from his brother's crimes for decades. I also learned that the Caldwell case had never really faded from public interest. There were documentaries, podcasts, books, and websites dedicated to studying William Caldwell and his crimes. He'd become something of a cult figure among true crime enthusiasts, with some even writing to him in prison. The thought that people were fascinated by my biological father's crimes, they saw him as an interesting subject for entertainment, made me sick. These weren't stories to them. They were real people who had died horrible deaths because of the man whose DNA I carried. I drove home in a daze, my head spinning with information I wished I could unknow. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw David's car parked there. He had a key and had obviously let himself in to wait for me. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to figure out how to tell the man I was going to marry in 4 months that he was engaged to I managed to avoid everyone for 3 days. Turned off my phone, didn't answer my door, and called in sick to work with some excuse about food poisoning. I spent those 72 hours in my house, pacing, crying, and researching everything I could find about genetic predispositions to violence. What I learned was both terrifying and confusing.
Ow.
Studies showed that certain genetic markers could increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior, but only when combined with environmental factors like childhood abuse or trauma. Nature versus nurture wasn't a simple equation. And being related to a violent person didn't automatically make you violent yourself. But it also didn't guarantee that you wouldn't be. On Thursday morning, my isolation was interrupted by pounding on my front door. I ignored it at first, assuming it was David or my parents, but the knocking became increasingly insistent.
Jessica.
It was Michael's voice, using his authoritative doctor tone. I know you're in there. Open the door, or I'm going to assume you're having a medical emergency and call 911. I dragged myself to the door, catching a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. I looked terrible. Unwashed hair, dark circles under my eyes, wearing the same clothes I'd slept in for 2 nights. When I opened the door, Michael pushed past me into the house, followed by Emma and my parents. They all looked worried and exhausted. "We're staging an intervention," Emma announced, closing the door behind them. "Can't just disappear and refuse to talk to anyone." "I need more time," I said, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Time for what?" Michael asked gently. "Jessica, whatever you found out, we can help you deal with it, but not if you shut us out." I looked at my parents, standing awkwardly in my living room. "Do they know what I discovered?" Mom nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "We told them everything last night. We should have done it years ago." "You told them about William Caldwell?" I asked, and all three of my siblings flinched at the name. "We told them that your biological father was a criminal," Dad said carefully, "that we'd kept it from all of you to protect you." "A criminal?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "He wasn't just a criminal, Dad. He was a serial killer. He murdered at least 6 women because they looked like my mother, because they looked like me." The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Emma spoke up. "So what?" she said, and everyone turned to stare at her. "So what if he was a monster? That doesn't make you one, doesn't it?" I asked. "How do you know? How do any of us know what I'm capable of? What if I have children and pass on whatever made him into what he was?" "That's not how genetics work," Michael said firmly. "Jessica, I'm a doctor. I understand heredity better than most people, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that being related to someone who committed crimes doesn't make you a criminal. But it increases the risk," I argued. "You can't tell me there's no genetic component to violent behavior." "There are genetic factors that can contribute to aggression, yes," Michael admitted, "but they require environmental triggers. You were raised by 2 of the most loving, stable people I've ever known. You've never shown any signs of violent tendencies. You work helping families in crisis, for God's sake." "What about my own children, though?" I asked. "What if I marry David and have kids, and they inherit something from William Caldwell? What if they grow up to hurt people?" Mom stepped forward then, her face wet with tears. "Jessica, honey, do you think we didn't wrestle with these same questions when we adopted you? Do you think we didn't worry about what you might have inherited?" I stared at her, not understanding. "We knew," she continued. "Not about the murders. Those didn't happen until later. But we knew your biological father had been abusive, that he had problems with anger and control. The adoption agency told us about Patricia's reasons for leaving him." "And you still wanted me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "We didn't want you despite those concerns," Dad said, moving to stand beside Mom. "We wanted you because we believed that love could overcome genetics, that the environment we provided would matter more than whatever biological predispositions you might have inherited." "And we were right," Emma added. "Look at who you became, Jessica. Look at your life, your career, your relationships. You're nothing like him." "But what if I am deep down?" whispered. "What if there's something dark in me that just hasn't been triggered yet?" "Then we'll deal with it together," Michael said simply. 8. That's what families do. I broke down then, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. My family surrounded me, holding me while I cried out, 34 years of fear I didn't even know I'd been carrying. When I finally calmed down enough to speak, I told them about my plan to leave, to disappear and start over somewhere else. The reaction was immediate and fierce. "Absolutely not," Emma said. "You're not going anywhere. You can't run from your genetics," Michael added. "You can't run from people who love you." "What about David?" I asked. "How can I marry him knowing what I know now? How can I ask him to take on this burden?" "That's his choice to make," Dad said. "But you have to give him the opportunity to choose. You can't make that decision for him." They stayed with me for hours that day, talking through everything I'd learned and helping me process the emotional impact. By evening, I felt wrung out but slightly more stable. The next morning, I finally called David. He came over immediately, and I could see the relief on his face when I answered the door looking more like myself. "I need to tell you something," I said before he could even sit down. "Something that might change how you feel about marrying me." And then I told him everything. About the DNA test, about William Caldwell, about the murders and the victims who looked like me. I watched his face carefully, waiting for the moment when he would realize he was engaged to damaged goods. But that moment never came. When I finished talking, David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he reached over and took my hands. "I'm sorry you had to find out about this," he said. I'm sorry your biological mother went through what she did, and I'm sorry you're carrying this burden now. But none of this changes how I feel about you." "How can you say that?" I asked. "I'm the daughter of a serial killer, David. What if our children inherit something from him? Then we'll love them and raise them right, just like your parents did with you," he said firmly. "Jessica, genetics aren't destiny. The man who raised you, who coached Little League and volunteered in the community, that's your real father. The values he and your mom instilled in you, the environment they created for you, that's what made you who you are." "But what if people find out?" I asked. "What if someone recognizes the connection and it becomes public? Your career, your reputation." "I don't care about any of that," David said, and I could tell he meant it. "I care about you. I care about the life we're building together. I care about the family we're going to create. William Caldwell has nothing to do with any of that." Over the following weeks, David proved his words with his actions. He researched everything he could find about genetic predispositions to violence, consulted with colleagues who specialized in behavioral genetics, and even arranged for us to meet with a genetic counselor who specialized in family planning for people with concerning family histories. The counselor was reassuring, but realistic. Yes, there could be genetic factors that contributed to violent behavior, but the research showed that environmental factors were much more significant. Children raised in loving, stable homes with strong moral guidance rarely developed serious behavioral problems regardless of their genetic heritage. "The fact that you're here asking these questions shows that you're exactly the kind of parent who would raise healthy, well-adjusted children," she told us. "Your concern about these issues is actually protective. It means you'd be vigilant about providing the right environment and seeking help if needed." Slowly, Robert Caldwell Jr. and I met at a small diner in Albany, about halfway between our respective homes. I'd driven there on a sunny Saturday morning in late July, with David's support and my family's blessings, finally ready to face this last piece of my biological puzzle. I recognized him immediately when I walked into the restaurant. He had the same general build as my adoptive father, but his eyes were unmistakably familiar. They were my eyes, the eyes I'd seen in the mirror my entire life, but never understood the origin of. Robert stood up as I approached, and for a moment we just looked at each other, two strangers connected by genetics and tragedy. "You look like her," he said finally. "Like Patricia. I only met her a few times, but you have her face." He ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes making awkward small talk, both of us dancing around the enormous elephant in the room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Tell me about him," I said. Robert's face aged 10 years in an instant. "Billy wasn't born evil," he said quietly. "I need you to know that first. Whatever he became later, he started as just a kid who got dealt a really bad hand." Over the next 2 hours, Robert painted a picture of the Caldwell family that was both heartbreaking and horrifying. Their father had been violent and unpredictable. Their mother had suffered from untreated mental illness, and both boys had grown up in an atmosphere of fear and chaos. "The difference between Billy and me," Robert explained, "was that I got out early. I joined the military at 17 and never went back home. Billy stayed, and that house, that environment, it twisted something in him." Robert had been serving overseas when William met and married Patricia. By the time he returned to civilian life, they'd already divorced, and Patricia had disappeared with their baby. "I tried to help him after she left," Robert said. He was consumed with rage, talking constantly about finding her and getting his daughter back. "I thought it was just hurt feelings, the kind of stuff people say when they're going through a divorce. I never imagined it would turn into what it became." When the murders started in 1983, Robert had been living in Buffalo with his own wife and children. It took months for police to connect the crimes to his brother, and when they did, Robert's world fell apart. "I was a high school teacher," he told me. "Been for 15 years. When the news broke that I was the Albany Strangler's brother, I lost my job. My kids were harassed at school. We had to move 3 times. The whole family was destroyed by what Billy did." Robert had tried to maintain some relationship with his brother after the arrest, visiting him in prison a few times in the early years. But William showed no remorse, no recognition of the pain he'd caused, no concern for how his actions had affected everyone else in the family. "The last time I saw him was 1995, Robert said. "He spent the entire visit talking about you, how he was going to find you someday, how he was going to explain his side of the story, how you would understand that he was the real victim. It was sick, and I couldn't listen to it anymore. That conversation had haunted Robert for decades. He changed his name, moved across the country, and tried to build a new life. But he'd also spent years wondering about me, worrying about what would happen if William ever managed to track me down, hoping that wherever I was safe and loved. When I got your message through the Ancestry site, I cried, he admitted. Not just because I'd found you, but because you'd found me. It meant you were curious about your history, which meant you were probably okay. If you'd been damaged or troubled, you wouldn't have been doing genealogy research. I told him about my adoptive family, my career, my engagement to David. I showed him photos on my phone of family gatherings and vacations, proof that his hopes for me had been realized. They saved you, he said, looking at a picture of me with my parents at my college graduation. Patricia died knowing she'd done the right thing, and she was right. These people gave you the life she wanted you to have. We talked about genetics, about nature versus nurture, about the fears I'd been carrying since discovering the truth about William.
Robert,
it turned out, had been wrestling with the same concerns about his own children. I have 3 kids, he told me, 2 sons and a daughter. When they were growing up, especially my boys, I watched them like a hawk for any signs of aggression or violence. I probably drove my wife crazy with my vigilance. Did you ever see anything that worried you? I asked. Normal kid stuff. Fights at school, teenage rebellion, temper tantrums when they were little, but nothing that seemed abnormal or concerning. He smiled sadly. They're all adults now with families of their own. Good people. One's a teacher like I was, one's an engineer, and my daughter's a nurse. They don't even know about their uncle. I've never told them. We discussed whether that was the right choice, whether family secrets were protective or harmful. Robert believed that his children were better off not knowing. They'd been raised with enough love and stability that the knowledge couldn't help them, but might hurt them. But you're different, he said. You sought this information out. You needed to know, which means you're strong enough to handle it. Before we parted that day, Robert gave me something I hadn't expected. Information about Patricia. He'd kept in touch with some of her friends from before she married William, and he'd been able to piece together more of her story. She was an artist, he told me, pulling out a small sketchbook from his briefcase. She drew constantly. Her friend Margie saved some of her sketches and gave them to me a few years ago, thinking I might want to pass them on to you someday if I ever found you. I opened the sketchbook with trembling hands. The pages were filled with beautiful, detailed drawings, landscapes, portraits, still lifes. Patricia had been incredibly talented. Emma gets her artistic ability from Patricia, I realized, thinking of my sister's natural talent. Probably Robert agreed. Genetics aren't just about the bad stuff. You've got good things from both sides of your biological family. That thought stayed with me during the drive home. For months, I'd been focused on what terrible traits I might have inherited from William Caldwell. But I'd never considered what positive qualities might have come from Patricia. Or even from the Caldwell side before it was corrupted by violence and trauma. When I got home, David was waiting with dinner and endless questions about how the meeting had gone. I told him everything, showing him Patricia's sketches and sharing Robert's perspectives on family and genetics. I think I'm ready now, I told him that night as we were getting ready for bed. Ready for what? Ready to stop being afraid of who I am? Ready to move forward with our wedding, our plans for children, our life together? Ready to be Jessica Thompson instead of Jessica Caldwell? The wedding took place, as scheduled in October, surrounded by both families and all our friends. My parents walked me down the aisle together, and when the officiant asked, "Who gives this woman in marriage?" they answered in unison, "We do, with love and pride." David and I honeymooned in Italy, and when we came back, we started trying for children immediately. I was 35 by then, and didn't want to wait any longer. The fears about genetic inheritance were still there, but they'd been transformed from paralyzing terror into manageable concern. I got pregnant 4 months later. Throughout the pregnancy, I was vigilant about prenatal care, genetic testing, and monitoring for any potential issues. Everything came back normal. Our son, James Robert Thompson, named for both grandfathers, was born healthy and perfect in August. Looking at him for the first time, I felt nothing but pure love and hope. This was my child, David's child, raised by 2 people who would give him every advantage in life. Whatever genetics he'd inherited from me would be balanced by David's stability and surrounded by the love of two families who had already proven that nurture could triumph over nature. James is 5 years old now. He's funny, kind, creative, and shows no signs of anything concerning. He loves to draw like his Aunt Emma, reads voraciously like his grandfather Robert, and has David's gentle temperament. We've been blessed with a daughter, too, little Patricia, named for the grandmother she'll never meet but whose artistic genes she seems to have inherited. I still think about William Caldwell sometimes, especially when true crime documentaries or podcasts feature his case. But he's not my father in any way that matters. The man who taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, walked me down the aisle, and now spoils his grandchildren. That's my father. I've maintained a relationship with Robert, and he's become like the uncle he always was genetically, but never got to be practically. My children know him as Uncle Robert, and someday, when they're old enough, I'll tell them the truth about their family history. But I'll tell them the whole truth. About Patricia's courage, about my parents' love, about how people can overcome their genetics through the choices they make and the environments they create. The DNA test that was supposed to give me medical information for family planning ended up giving me something much more valuable. The knowledge that identity isn't determined by biology. I am not the daughter of a serial killer. I am the daughter of two teachers who chose to love me. I am the wife of a good